So let's try and make this a little bit more concrete. Let's go ahead and look at some screenshots from 270towin.com, which is a pretty important website as we study the Electoral College. And let's look at some elections in specific. So here is a screenshot from the election of 2004, and you can always tell that on 270 to Win by the upper right-hand corner where they tell you what election you're looking at. This was the election between George W. Bush and John Kerry. Bush was the Republican, and his winning states are shown in red, while Kerry was a Democrat, and his winning states are shown in blue. And we know from history that George Bush won this election. He carried a lot of states. He earned a lot of electoral votes. You can also see John Kerry did win some states and did win some electoral votes. Now, a couple things to think about. Now, just because George Bush won a bunch of these states, and they are showing as red and Republican on this map, does not mean that people did not vote for John Kerry in those states, and vice versa. Just because John Kerry won a state like, say, Illinois, does not mean that people did not vote for W. Bush in Illinois. It's just that, remember, this is a winner-take-all system. So in a state like Illinois, John Kerry must have won 50% plus one vote from the popular vote, yet he wins all of the electoral votes. So it could have been a very close race in Illinois. Perhaps John Kerry only won that state by 2 votes. Or maybe it was a blowout where everybody in Illinois voted for Kerry. Same thing down in Texas. While all the electoral votes went to Bush and is showing as red and Republican, that does not mean that every single Texan voted for him. So this shows you the Electoral College level in terms of which state's votes went to which candidate. But sometimes in terms of our analysis of elections, it's a little bit easier and more informative to look at the elections on the county level so we can see where the people were and how they voted. So this map shows the 2004 election at the county level. So you can see that even states like Illinois that voted their electoral votes for the Democratic or blue candidate, if you look at it by county, you can see that not every county voted exclusively for the Democratic candidate. It's just that the Democratic candidate did earn 50% plus one. So if you look at Illinois, which is just southwest of Lake Michigan there, you can see those counties that are very, very dark blue are the counties that voted strongly for John Kerry, the Democrat. And those counties that are dark red voted predominantly for the Republican candidate, W. Bush. And then anything that's lighter red or lighter blue means that there was more of a mix in terms of people in that county voting for either side. So here we start to see some interesting trends. If we look at Illinois, and specifically that very dark blue county, which is Cook County, where Chicago is, we start to see the pattern where the previous population map is reinforced. Chicago is a very large city of probably 8 to 10 million people based on how you're counting. That county voted predominantly Democrat. If you look at other major city areas in the nation, New York City in the upper right, Boston, even down in the southeast in Miami, most of the major urban areas, so the cities with a lot of populations, they tended to vote Democrat. And so we start to see a pattern here that many urban areas where there are a lot of people smashed together with a lot of language, ethnic, religious diversity, these areas tend to attract more liberal voters. And think about it. You're going to have to probably be somewhat tolerant of diversity and of change and of newness and of a lot of different ideas in order to comfortably live in a city. If you're the kind of person who says, you know what, I don't think I want that diversity. I want the tradition of white America, of exceptionally religious, of the tradition, then the city probably isn't going to be for you. You're probably going to look for someplace a little bit more homogenized, which means more the same. And so you're probably going to move away from cities and move toward the rural or the countryside areas. And those are predominantly shown in red, sometimes pink, sometimes darker red. You can see how where people live and how they think and feel and believe tends to reflect how they vote. To go back to the electoral level, A state like Illinois, since Chicago has like 10 million people in the city of Chicago, and most of them probably voted for the Democratic candidate, even though there are farmers in central and southern Illinois and they're more conservative and they voted for the Republican, because Chicago is so big and has so many more popular votes in that area, it carries the whole state. And we can see that in a lot of other states like this, going for either candidate. Minnesota is the same way. The twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul tend to carry the liberal vote for all of Minnesota. In Wisconsin, Madison and Milwaukee tend to carry the liberal vote for all of that state. In Michigan, it's Detroit. In New York, it's New York City. In Pennsylvania, it's Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. So even though there are conservative areas of these states, maybe some more farmland, some more rural areas, because they have some major population-sized cities, those tend to carry the electoral votes for all of that state. Now, conversely, if we look down in Texas, there are some major areas there. Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, Houston. They are urban areas, but because they tend to be urban areas that are more conservative than, say, Chicago, San Francisco, Denver. So then in Texas, for example, their urban areas tend to vote conservative also, which is mirrored in the plains and the farmland of Texas. So Texas, for the most part, traditionally votes Republican because its cities and its rural areas or farmland areas also vote conservatively. Now, we could sit and discuss, why in the middle of New Mexico are there some really dark areas? Why in the middle of Montana is there a dark liberal area? Like, what's going on there? We could get into those and study that a little bit more. We're not going to on this podcast, but what we're trying to get you to look at is, do you see the trends between how urban areas, big cities, tend to vote more liberally and vote for Democrats? Meanwhile, the rural areas, the farmland areas, tend to vote more conservatively and vote for the Republicans. Another interesting distortion here, if we take the nation's map and distort the states based on their electoral power, based on who has the most votes and who makes the most difference in an election, you can see the bigger states are the ones that have the major metropolitan areas, for the most part, except for Texas, and they are also the ones who cast the most power in the Electoral College. States like Florida, California, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, even Connecticut and Rhode Island. Even though they are small geographically, and on a normal map they are exceptionally small, because they have so many people in them and they have so much electoral power that in a presidential election, a state like Rhode Island or Connecticut has more power than a state like Wyoming or Montana. Montana, large state. Alaska, humongous state. But it has very little electoral power because it has a very small population. So now, let's move on to the 2008 election. And you can see some descriptors there. Blue states were those who voted for Barack Obama, and the red were those states that voted for John McCain. You can see that the patterns in 2008 were very similar for the most part of those patterns that we saw in 2004. The Midwest and the Northeast voted Democrat. The far west voted Democrat also, but a majority of the central and south of the United States voted for the Republican. But in this case, we had some states that kind of changed how they were voting. States like Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, Colorado, New Mexico, and Nevada. They had previously voted Republican in 2004, and here they are voting Democrat. And so what that means is 50% plus one people must have voted for Obama in those states. Therefore, he won all of the electoral votes. Now you see that Nebraska's purple. And I think Nebraska is the one state that has a slightly weird system. It is not a winner-take-all system in that Nebraska can split its electoral votes based on how the popular vote goes. So in a state like Colorado, if 50% plus one vote for the Democrat wins all 9 votes. But in Nebraska, if the Democrat wins 60% and the Republican wins 40%, they can split up their 5 votes 3 and 2. So just a difference in that state. The rest of our states are winner-take-all, hence the very dark red or very dark blue based on the state level. And so to compare And the point of this comparison is to show the trends in voting in the modern era. If we go back to 2000, we see for the most part many of the states that voted the way they did in 04 and 08 voted the same way even back in 2000. So again, we see the trend. For the most part, the Midwest and the Northeast is voting Democrat, as well as the far West. And again, the central part of the state and the South is voting for the Republican. So the point is, think about socially, economically, politically, where are the conservative voters in our nation? Where are the more liberal voters in our nation? And they tend to be represented at the electoral level in the states across the Union.